This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Almost all the votes now have been counted, and though unofficially they show that election 78, the most expensive in American history, $200 million worth, went about as expected. The Republicans made slight gains, as is usual for the minority party in non-presidential elections. The Democrats retained their large working majorities, but the Republicans did pick up 3 Senate seats, 6 governorships, and 10 or 12 House seats. The voters spread the Proposition 13 tax revolt to a dozen more states, and they were not quite as apathetic as anticipated. CBS News estimating the turnout at about 37% of the eligible voters. Of the 35 Senate seats at stake, the Republicans won 20, the Democrats 15, and that trims the Senate Democratic majority to 59 to 41. Of the 36 governorships up, the Republicans won 11, the Democrats 25, trimming the Democratic majority to 32 to 18. One of those Republican victories came in Texas, where both the gubernatorial and Senate races remained cliffhangers until today. Eric Engberg has the details.
William Clement spent $6 million, much of it from his personal fortune, to spread his message. That as a tough-minded businessman, he would keep taxes down, and that as a Republican with a penchant for bluntness, he would protect the state's oil interests from the Carter administration. The voters, apparently tired of cozy Democratic rule, made him the first GOP governor in 105 years.
I think that Texas and the electorate want a clear choice, and they are entitled to a clear choice. And I represent that kind of a choice.
John Hill, an old-school Democrat who kept his distance from the Carter administration, was done in by the vote in the big cities, where large numbers of Republicans have moved from the north as part of the Sun Belt migration. He spent half of what Clements did.
There was an unprecedented amount of money, and obviously it has to be weighed as a significant factor.
The Republican sweep at the top of the ticket was completed by Senator John Tower winning a 4th term. His contest with Congressman Bob Kruger was so close, it was midday before Tower emerged from his motel room with his wife and daughters to claim victory and to venture an opinion which even some Democrats were conceding.
I believe this election now is the harbinger of a two-party system in Texas.
The Tower-Kruger race was fought on a bitter personal level, but gentle rhetoric prevailed today. Former English professor Kruger, his voice nearly gone from exhaustion, even managed to thank his workers with a quote from Polonius in Shakespeare's Hamlet.
Polonius says to Laertes, "Those friends thou hast and their adoption tried, grapple them to thy soul with hoops of steel."
While losing the big ones, the Democrats continued to dominate the legislature and congressional seats, but the Clements upset means that this longtime one-party state will now be the largest in the Union with a Republican governor. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Dallas.
Here's how some of the other close ones went. In Virginia, Republican John Warner defeating Andrew Miller for the Senate, but by only 4,500 votes, a margin so narrow it could change. In New Hampshire, airline pilot Gordon Humphrey ousting Democratic Senator Thomas McIntyre, but only by 4,400 votes. And in West Virginia, Democratic Senator Jennings Randolph, a 34-year veteran of Capitol Hill, hanging on to his seat by only 4,500 votes over former Governor Arch Moore. We'll have more on the election returns in a minute.
Some people like their bread dark and coarse, and some like it white for its light texture. But there's another choice, Roman meal. Roman meal combines the natural goodness of whole grain, hard red spring wheat and rye, bran and flaxseed meal with other ingredients like enriched flour and honey. The result? A light brown bread with good taste and tender texture. Roman meal. There's no other bread like it, and your Roman meal bakery thought you'd like to know.
Oldsmobile announces a new state-of-the-art and personal luxury car design, the all-new Toronado. Built on the Olds heritage of front-wheel drive, the new Toronado offers a choice of standard gasoline or available diesel V8 engines, plus standard features like electronic level control and independent four-wheel suspension for impressive roadability. Discover the elegant inner world of Oldsmobile's Toronado. Have one built for you.
In addition to Governor-elect Bill Clements' upset victory in Texas, there were some other impressive Republican wins. Mississippi is sending its first Republican senator to Washington since Reconstruction, Thad Cochran. But nowhere was the GOP showing more stunning than in Minnesota, where the Democratic Farmer-Labor Party of Hubert Humphrey finds itself in shambles today. Don Webster has the details.
The DFL party has suffered a tragic loss in this election year of 1978.
Robert Short ought to know. He was badly beaten for Hubert Humphrey's old Senate seat by political novice David Durenberger, who today forecast a new era in Minnesota politics.
Out of this year's election will come a new Republican Party in the state of Minnesota. But just as importantly, out of this year's election will come a strong and a healthy two-party system in this state.
In the other Senate race, Republican Rudy Boswich, also a political newcomer, defeated incumbent Wendell Anderson, who, as governor, had appointed himself to the Senate and alienated many voters. Today, Boswich was out shaking hands, not to win votes, but to thank citizens for the upset. Longtime Republican Congressman Albert Quee won the governor's race, and the Republicans picked up more than 30 seats in the State House of Representatives. Incumbent Governor Rudy Perpich had been favored, but was also buried in the Republican landslide. Also embarrassed was Vice President Mondale. He visited his home state numerous times and convinced President Carter to come twice to support DFL candidates. What the Democrats lacked was a Hubert Humphrey to pull them all together. But as one political expert said, there aren't that many Hubert Humphreys. Don Webster, CBS News, Minneapolis.
Minnesota was but a headline, a banner headline, on the story that the Midwest belonged to the Republicans in this election. Dan Rather has more on that.
A close analysis of returns indicates two main causes for the Democrats' Minnesota disaster. Liberals couldn't stomach voting for conservative Robert Short. This was especially apparent in the normally Democratic Twin Cities area. And the state as a whole couldn't stomach Wendell Anderson's deal to have himself appointed last year to Walter Mondale's Senate seat. While the party of the old warhorse Hubert Humphrey was limping home in Minnesota, it was a different story for an old warhorse of a candidate in Ohio. 69-year-old Republican Governor James Rhodes once again managed to come from behind win. Possibly the most significant result in the Midwest was the defeat of Iowa's one-term Democratic Senator Dick Clark, a down-the-line liberal who apparently was too liberal for many Iowans. That's how his opponent, Roger Jepsen, conservative former lieutenant governor, interpreted the mood of the voters.
They want less government involvement in their lives, less regulation, less control. They want a balanced budget. I think I have a mandate to work on those things, and I sure intend to.
Clark's upset was due partly to the Right to Life movement. The anti-abortionist had made Clark national target number one. He also lost support among normally Democratic Catholic voters because of his stand against tuition tax credits. But Clark appears to have gone down mostly because a general Republican tide was sweeping over Iowa, holding the governorship and regaining a congressional seat, as well as both houses of the state legislature. Also hurting Clark, his opponent's heavy emphasis upon tax cutting. Overall in the Midwest, the Republicans won a total of 8 governorships. The only one the Democrats won was an upset in Kansas. Net gain for the GOP, 3. They won 6 Senate seats, a pickup of 2. Nobody is calling it an earth-shaking comeback, but everybody agrees it is at least a start and will be helpful for 1980. Dan Rather, CBS News, New York.
Maybe nobody was calling it an earth-shaking comeback for the Republican Party, but Chairman Bill Brock acted today as if it were, and he too looked to the future. Barry Seraphin reports from Washington.
Brock told reporters that between now and 1980, the Republicans are going to continue to push the so-called Kemp-Roth proposal, or something like it, for a big tax cut.
We've got to deal with the primary economic issues, the pocketbook issues on which people are voting now and will be voting as long as the question of unemployment, recession, and inflation remain. As I say, if we can continue to improve in those areas, I think we'll win in 1980.
Senate Minority Leader Howard Baker disputes poll results indicating that Republicans goofed by concentrating on the tax issue and allowing Democrats to preempt issues such as government spending.
I don't think Republicans blew it at all. I think Republicans just haven't sold their theory well enough yet. But for my part, I intend to continue to do that, and I think we'll succeed.
For Baker and other potential 1980 GOP presidential candidates, it was essential for the party to make a decent showing in yesterday's elections. The The fact that there is likely to be a large group of Republican contenders for the White House 2 years from now is seen as healthy by party officials. They hope, however, that such rivalry does not lead to the kind of divisive bitterness that has plagued the party in the past. Those officials intend to continue giving special attention to state races to build what they call Republican rootstock. The GOP remains a minority party facing considerable obstacles. But if it does not have dramatic momentum now toward 1980, it at least has a somewhat larger base on which to build. Barry Serafin, CBS News, at Republican National Headquarters, Washington.
At the White House, administration officials tried to put the best face on the election, but the face had a wary eye cocked toward 1980. Robert Pierpoint reports.
What they're saying here today is just about what you'd expect, that most voters chose to elect Democrats, and since Jimmy Carter is a Democrat, that's good for Jimmy Carter. Would that it were that simple. In fact, the White House says the president campaigned in 28 states this year for 49 candidates, and 29 of them, or about 60%, won. No presidential aide is trying to claim that Mr. Carter actually made the difference in the outcome of a specific race, but they do believe he helped in several, which they prefer not to name. One White House political advisor declared, quote, "To the extent we can measure the mood of the voters and what they want from government, it is pretty closely aligned to this president." Translated, that appears to mean President Carter will press harder to hold down the budget and federal programs. And such expensive projects as national health insurance will be pushed very carefully, if at all. What really worries the president's political advisors is the loss of several governor's races in such important states as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Texas. As one of them put it today, "I sure hate to go into the 1980 election with all those key posts in the hands of the Republicans." Robert Pierpoint, CBS News at the White House.
We've already noted the defeats of Democratic Senators Anderson of Minnesota, Clark of Iowa, and McIntyre of New Hampshire. Democratic Senators Floyd Haskell of Colorado and William Hathaway of Maine also lost. The Republicans tasted defeat too, losing two of their senators, Robert Griffin of Michigan and Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, the Senate's only black member. Three-term conservative Republican Governor Meldrum Thompson also lost in New Hampshire.
You give a man a couple of days to himself and a Black & Decker workmate, and there's almost nothing he can't do. You can pound on it, saw on it, hammer on it, and sand on it. The sturdy vice jaws do the holding for you. You can clamp on it, paint on it, cut a shape on it, drive a screw on it. There's almost nothing you can't do. When America has a job to do, it reaches for Black & Decker.
7 a.m., Jean cooks a complete breakfast in her Litton Meal-in-One, the first microwave oven to cook 1, 2, 3 foods all at once. Then an afternoon party lunch, thanks to a solid-state memory that lets her just touch and cook automatically, and helps get Jean, her family, and tonight's dinner ready all at once.
The Meal-in-One makes every meal easier. See how Litton is changing the way America cooks.
Before the election, CBS News and the New York Times questioned 859 congressional incumbents and their opponents about issues. During the election, we asked the same questions of some 9,000 voters across the country after they had cast their ballots. Bruce Morton weighed those findings against the election returns.
The voters were conservative. On social issues, they were for the death penalty, against the federal government's paying for abortions for poor women. Conservative on economic issues. The federal government should have to balance its budget. Cutting government spending is more important than cutting taxes. Conservative. So whom did they elect to the House? The same old crowd mostly, mainly Democrats. In fact, of all those incumbent congressmen who ran for re-election yesterday, 95% won. They did it in part by putting on conservative clothes. The newly elected Congress says it's for balancing the federal budget too. Well, that's what they say. What effect did President Carter have? Maybe not much. Democrats who won House seats yesterday mostly said the president didn't affect their campaigns. Over half the Republicans who won said the president helped. In other words, they ran against him, which may suggest another standoffish 2 years between the president and Congress. The new Congress and the voters seem to agree on most issues. Where they didn't, our poll shows the voters were ready for tougher anti-inflation action than either the Congress or Mr. Carter. The Congress wants to roll back the scheduled increases in the Social Security tax, which you'd think would be popular. But the voters want to keep the tax hike, and they even told our pollsters they oppose a big cut in income taxes. President Carter is against wage and price controls. Our voters said they'd like to see wage and price increases limited. For controls, in other words. Finally, the voters in our sample are not named Pollyanna. Asked how much of what your congressional candidate promised do you think he'll be able to do, our voters answered about half. Bruce Morton, CBS News, New York.
In spite of the GOP House gains, the Democrats remain firmly in control there. All 435 seats were up, and with 2 races undecided, the new House now shapes up as 275 Democrats and 158 Republicans. Women lost 2 of their seats in the House, but gained 1 in the Senate. The new Congress will contain 16 women representatives and Nancy Landon Kassebaum, daughter of the 1936 Republican presidential candidate Alf Landon. She won her Senate race in Kansas. More on that from Bob Jordan.
Senator-elect Nancy Landon Kassebaum answered many phone calls at her home this morning. The 46-year-old mother of 4 said she was relaxed for the first time in many weeks. And she said being former Governor Alf Landon's daughter didn't hurt her.
Well, it was an important part of my identification in the primary. And it's an identification I'm very proud of. I don't believe it was that much of a factor, particularly in the general election.
During the campaign, she stressed issues such as inflation instead of the Landon name. She called herself Nancy Kassebaum, even though she is legally separated from her husband. And she said she would provide a fresh voice when told she lacked experience in public office. Her 91-year-old father, who lives in Topeka, campaigned only a few times for her and offers her advice when he is called upon.
Being the only woman in the United States Senate, she's going to be under pretty much of a spotlight.
Mrs. Kassebaum, who has been exposed to politics all of her life, agrees life in the Senate will be difficult, not only because she's a freshman, but because she's the only woman.
I think it will be helpful to perhaps be an example for women getting more involved. It's perhaps a hesitancy on women's part whether they can do it. And I hope that this will show that, as a matter of fact, we can.
In a couple of weeks, she will go to Washington to find a place to live. Meanwhile, she will continue her work as vice president of 2 Wichita radio stations, try to spend more time with her children, and tend to chores that have long been overlooked.
End of the campaign.
Bob Jordan, CBS News, Mays, Kansas.
Among blacks, they held on to their 15 House seats, but they lost that 1 in the Senate. President Carter has signed the compromise $18.7 billion tax cut bill, this despite his own misgivings that it will chiefly benefit upper-income taxpayers. News Secretary Jody Powell said the president signed the bill yesterday but held up the announcement so he would not be accused of playing Election Day politics. The bill passed by Congress the day before adjournment gives major relief to wealthy investors and cuts business taxes. Meanwhile, the president addressed an anti-inflation forum in Hartford, Connecticut by telephone, saying the administration will monitor the top 400 to 500 businesses in the country to make sure they comply with his price increase guidelines. The stock market today up in light trading.
I'm accustomed to riding around in Cadillacs. So why am I in this AMC Pacer wagon instead of a Cadillac? Well, this Pacer is not only quite luxurious and handles so easily, but it also has an astounding amount of room. Did you know that the AMC Pacer is just about as wide as a Cadillac? So it feels like a big car, even though it isn't. And I feel like I'm in a big car, even though I'm not.
AMC Pacer feels like a big car, but it isn't.
When you farm your own land, the work never ends, but you do it with pride and all the strength you can muster. But now comes Miller time. Time to head for the best tasting beer you can find. America's quality beer, Miller High Life.
When it's time to relax, one beer stands clear. Beer after beer. If you've got the time, we've got the beer. Miller Beer.
The Iranian military today continued its crackdown on opposition to the Shah. Martial law officials arrested former Prime Minister Amir Abbas Hoveyda, who once was the Shah's closest aide. Hoveyda, who stepped down a year ago, was charged with working against Iran's constitutional government. Today's arrest followed those yesterday of 132 prominent Iranians, including the former secret police chief. Under martial law, all of them may be held indefinitely without trial. Iran's capital, Tehran, appeared to be returning to normal today. There were no reports of rioting, and this may be due in part to American assistance. Bernard Kalb reports from the State Department.
Informed sources say the administration discussed the possibility of making U.S. Army teams available to train the Shah's troops in riot control, but that the Shah never asked the U.S. for that kind of help. None of this was mentioned during a news briefing here by press officer Jill Shooker. She did confirm that the U.S. recently sold what was called crowd control equipment to Iran, this in response to Iranian requests. Just how much was sold, Shooker did not say, but she disclosed that the equipment included tear gas, police shields, and nightsticks. And while she described the situation in Tehran as now being essentially calm, she noted that the U.S. Embassy there had requested assistance in the wake of some Molotov cocktails exploding in a U.S. residential area. 2 American homes reported hit. No Americans injured. As for a rumor that swept around the world earlier in the day that the Shah had been shot, this was knocked down by U.S. officials, who said that they knew that the Shah had been accepting telephone calls later in the day. Bernard Kalb, CBS News, the State Department.
The Shah today ordered an investigation into the sources of wealth and property of all members of the royal family. He promised that anything illegally acquired would be returned to its rightful owners. Iranian authorities arrested the UPI bureau manager in Tehran, Saeed Rizvi, a Pakistani national, and ordered him deported to London. No reason given immediately. Israel's chief negotiators in the Washington treaty talks with Egypt gave Secretary of State Vance some bad news today. The peace negotiations, once again, are in trouble. Marvin Kalb reports.
The good diplomat usually disguises his emotions, and both Foreign Minister Dayan and Defense Minister Weizmann seemed almost casual as they arrived for their meeting with Secretary Vance. They even managed to smile for the cameraman. But the fact is, it was all a show. Weizmann, just back from Jerusalem, was really quite disturbed. He told Vance the Israeli cabinet had opposed any linkage between a peace treaty with Egypt and follow-up talks concerning the Palestinians. The same linkage that had already been spelled out in 12 very general but undisclosed words in the preamble to the treaty that the Israeli and Egyptian negotiators here had earlier agreed to. This represented a serious setback, especially since the Egyptians now want to tighten the linkage. No one is talking any longer about an imminent signing of a peace treaty, though everyone is still pledged to complete the negotiation.
Vance was so concerned that he went to the White House for an urgent, unscheduled meeting with President Carter, who is now expected to involve himself in the negotiations once again. Weizmann and Dayan had been on the phone to Prime Minister Begin, now on a state visit to Canada, trying to enlist his support against a suddenly rebellious cabinet. Begin is scheduled to return to Israel early next week, probably with Dayan and Weizmann, hoping not only to maintain the negotiation, but also to head off any challenge to his leadership. Marvin Kalb, CBS News, the State Department.
You're Dick Van Patten.
Oh, yes.
You made me lose weight.
I what?
Well, sure, with your PVM, because that diet really limits the calories.
Oh, yes. Well, if you like regular PVM, you'll love their new chocolate and vanilla.
Chocolate and vanilla?
Yep. On the diet, you mix them with low-fat milk in place of breakfast and lunch, and you get menus for full-course diet dinners.
It's terrific. He made me lose weight.
PVM and its diet plan, the delicious way to lose weight.
In this world of the ordinary, there is a remarkable nasal spray that lasts and lasts up to 12 continuous hours. Duration. Duration nasal spray relieves up to 12 continuous hours. Duration relieves nasal stuffiness and sinus congestion. So just one use lets you work all day. Just one use lets you sleep all night. Duration relieves up to 12 continuous hours. Duration with the longest lasting nasal decongestant.
For the 14th time since the group was formed in 1945, A member of the Navy's famous Blue Angels flying team has died in a crash. 30-year-old Lieutenant Michael Curtin of Lanham, Maryland, was rehearsing over Miramar Naval Air Station at San Diego for a Saturday air show, and our affiliate's camera was there. The A-4 Skyhawk jet suddenly crashed and blew up. Investigators are looking into the cause of that accident. The 12 states that passed tax relief or spending limitation issues were among 38 that had a total of some 200 referenda on their ballots. Among them, Virginia, New Jersey, and Florida all rejected legalized gambling issues. Missouri turned down the right-to-work measure. North Dakota rejected a proposal to put a lid on health costs. And California voted down restrictions on smoking in public places. A measure expanding the list of crimes punishable by death was approved in California, and voters reinstated the death penalty in Oregon. So-called gay rights measures were on 3 ballots. Gay rights advocates lost 1, Dade County, Florida, and they won 2 in Seattle and in perhaps the most publicized referendum in California. Barry Peterson has more on that story.
From the earliest returns, it was clear that Proposition 6 to fire homosexual teachers was losing, and gays in San Francisco were jubilant. In Southern California, they sang hymns at the headquarters of John Briggs, the conservative state senator who authored the measure. He vowed to try again.
The battle is not over.
Homosexual Larry Berner, who teaches 2nd grade in a small town north of San Francisco, was a major target of the Briggs campaign. The two debated before the election, and today Berner saw it as a personal victory.
There's a real message for gay people to come out of their closets, because that's how we won this election. We came out and we talked to our neighbors and our friends, and they accepted us as human beings.
Briggs argued that homosexual teachers were out to convert school children. Opponents, labor, religious leaders, politicians from Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan, argued witch hunt. Said one cheering celebrant, "It's obvious gays have a lot of friends in California." Barry Peterson, CBS News, San Francisco.
And that's the way it is. Wednesday, November 8th, 1978. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
All these foods were prepared in the Amana Touchmatic 2 radar range microwave oven. It's so simple to use. Set it to remember 4 different cooking programs, to remember your choice of 10 cooking speeds, or even to remember to change speeds as it cooks. This roast was cooked medium rare, juicy and tender, using Amana's accurate automatic temperature control in the Amana Touchmatic 2 radar range. Truly the next generation of microwave ovens, and only from Amana.
Filling up, drinking down. Delta's the faucet that's known all around. Soaking in, drinking up again. That's when Delta faucets are a very good friend. Delta Faucet, the name people trust. For washerless faucets, ask your plumber for us.
Delta Faucets. No washers, no washer worries.
This has been the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
I'm Richard Threlkel. The way the news changes from evening to morning can be the difference between night and day. We'll look at those changes tomorrow on the CBS Morning News.
Weekdays on CBS.
Stay tuned for Eyewitness News next on Channel 5 WTVF.